I acknowledge that I live, work and learn on Gadigal country. I recognise with gratitude the safe haven offered to my family at a time when life and a future was uncertain. I recognise the ongoing connections to lands, waters and skies of all traditional custodians across Australia. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and elders past and present, sovereignty never ceded. Good evening, dobry wieczór, dzień dobry and shalom. I am the Vice President of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Society of Polish Jews and their Descendants. As an organisation, we are dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the historical and cultural heritage of Jewish life in Poland and to foster understanding between current and future generations of the Polish and Jewish communities here in Australia. Once again, it gives us great pleasure to introduce esteemed educator and researcher Rita Nash, who in researching her parents' Holocaust survival experience realised that it represented a sweeping and complex story overlooked by researchers until recently. This, Rita's second webinar, focuses on the return of the remnants of Polish Jews to Polish lands, the viable lives they created over a 5-year period from 1945 until 1950, and the impact on them of the ongoing anti-Semitism and the onset of Stalinisation. There will be a short Q&A following the webinar. Please enter your questions in the chat and we will address as many questions as possible at the end. Thank you very much for your time, and I hand over now to Rita Nash. Thank you, Rita.
Thanks everyone for coming again. I'll just go straight into it. Yes, I'll explain this slide, this opening slide next. It's shortly, sorry. There's strong belief that you can tell most of 20th century history through cartoons, and this one to me sums up everything about the post-war situation in Europe. You can see Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill having a map of Europe in a jigsaw pattern, and they're having a lot of trouble trying to fit the pieces together. And that's exactly what happened. So after the end of the war, the Yalta Conference was in February, and the Potsdam Conference was after the end of the European War. And the big three, as they were called, that's Britain, Soviet Union and America. And they sit down to talk. Now, Stalin held most of the cards. I wrote that before the Zelensky and Trump meeting, so they stole it from me. So the West was indebted to Stalin and the Red Army, and Stalin was on a path to expand and control his hold on Eastern Europe. He insisted on retaining the Soviet annexation of the Polish Eastern Borderlands, which he took on the 17th of September 1939, and that constituted 52% of pre-war Poland at the present-day Ukraine and Belarus. So the world went to war to protect Poland's sovereignty. How could these leaders explain that after 6 years of carnage, and Poland was now less than half its original size, but they had a plan, the big three, to compensate Poland for this enormous loss? The Eastern Corridor of Germany, plus East Prussia and Danzig, would be ceded to Poland. And the rationale for that was that these lands had once belonged to the Piasts, which was a medieval ruling dynasty of Poland, and was never being returned to or recovered or regained by Poland. And this propaganda poster has got a nice young strong Pole, modern day Pole in 1945, and in the background is this I'm not even going to try and pretend to pronounce Bolesław him. He was a Piast leader who was very well remembered for expanding Polish territory. And you can see that he is guiding the young Pole to how to take over territory. The German residents who'd been there, by the way, for centuries and generations, and they were to be expelled. And that was seen to be an appropriate retribution for Germany starting the war. And so Poland in 1945 looks like this. This is the land that Stalin kept, the grey. The pink is the recovered territories or the regained territories or the returned territories. They had to keep finding euphemisms for this land. And these became part of Poland, as well as this little area up here. And that is what Poland looks like today, basically. It hasn't changed very much. It's just been tweaked here and there. So this is Poland now, and you can see the shape is completely different. And Jeff Schatz, who's a scholar in the field, made this very prescient remark on the new geographic map of Poland, of Europe. Poland was moved 150 miles west, while on the political map, it was moved radically to the east. So following Potsdam, close to 3 million Germans were expelled from the lands which had been ceded to Poland. And you can see, and over time from 1945 to 1950, 12 million Germans were expelled and moved westward. Well, they weren't moved, they were sent westward. They were sent to an occupied Germany, which did not have the resources nor the desire to care for these expellees. Many of them had already fled in fear of the incoming Red Army, and this was the first of many post-war population exchanges, homogenization, transfers, repatriation. Again, they were always looking for a euphemism, and they were nearly always based on ethnicity and border changes. And they were brutal. This movement was brutal. And Bertrand Russell, in the Times on the 19th of October 1945, remarked that in Eastern Europe now, mass deportations are being carried out on an unprecedented scale, and an attempt is being made to exterminate many millions of Germans, not by gas, but by depriving them of their homes and food. Expellees were, sorry, you can see with all those dark arrows, you can see how many were moving. And they were put into cattle wagons or open trucks with insufficient food, water, or adequate winter clothing, and long lines trudged in all weathers, as you can see down here with this woman and her young children, and it looks like her mother and elderly people there. And they're walking from Łódź to Berlin in the most terrible, one of the worst winters of the decade. About half of them, half a million died from disease, hypothermia, malnutrition, or they were also detained in shocking internment or labour camps. The atrocity was widespread, and these were locals who were just taking it out on the Germans, regardless of the fact that they were not involved in the war, these Germans. So they were kind of, you can see here this man's got a swastika drawn on his back. these people, and if you look at it carefully, they're elderly, and they've got white bands on their arms. Why? Because like the yellow star that the Jews had to wear, this was a way of identifying Germans. And so they're getting on the road and trying to do the best they could. And this is yet another post-war story that we just didn't know, haven't known much about, and haven't cared to know much about. They were allowed to take about 20 to 50 kilos of belongings, and they had to surrender the keys to their homes. And all property, all their property became the property of Poland. And once the Germans had left, the lands were declared to be empty. That's the word they used. This does not mean to say that the Germans, sorry, I lost my place a bit. This doesn't mean, the fact that they said it was empty doesn't mean that all the Germans had gone. That's not the case. But basically there were enough gone to say that those lands were now available to take over. I want to introduce you or explain to you, before we go on, the role of the Central Committee of Polish Jews. It was established on the 12th of November 1944, and it was the primary organisation representing and assisting Polish Jews in the aftermath of World War II. The CKZP was the linchpin for all post-war Jewish activities, and it was the go-between between the Jews and the Polish government. They set out, as you can, I'm not going to read these goals out, as you see on the left-hand side, but it was all about care, health, rehabilitation, training, job training. There was no one else to speak for the few Polish Jews left, and there was no one else to look after these broken people. And despite a lot of political infighting, it was an extraordinary body. Without it, not much would have been achieved for the Polish Jews from 1945 until it was disbanded in 1949. And I found this amazing poster. It's in Yiddish, and it's from the CKZP asking for settled Jews to provide assistance to the incoming Jews from the Soviet Union. So that'll all come into place shortly. Okay, so I've now set the stage for our main story. And we go to Lower Silesia, which was part of the, these new territories. So Sportschule camp became a branch of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp, and it was, which was the largest camp system in all of the concentration camps that the Nazi Germany had. In it were about 7,000 Polish Jews, not just Polish Jews, but also Poles. They were working as slave labourers in the textile and weaving mills. Now, Sportschule was liberated by the Red Army in May 1945. So it's down here. Sportschule is just tucked in there between Reichenbach or Jeżoniów, which is going to become very important to our talk, and Langenbielau, which was the German name for what is now Bielaba. So these people who had survived drifted to all these towns around here, and they didn't have anything else. They couldn't do it very much, so they just drifted, and they found these towns, which of course were full of empty buildings that the Germans had left. They immediately established a committee to assist the ex-prisoners. And that committee wrote to the Central Committee to inform them that they had survived and that they were alive and living in Lower Silesia. So I need to introduce you to Jakub Egit, this man here. He was a communist and he'd spent the war years in Kazakhstan. He wanted to create an autonomous Jewish region in Poland and had already presented these ideas to the CKZP. Itzhak Zuckerman was a hero of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and he was an ardent Zionist who wanted to build Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael. In May 1945, the CKZP sent Egit and Zuckerman to Lower Silesia to assess the situation there and what the other committee had told them about. They liked what they saw and reported so to the CKZP. And on the 17th of June, 1945, the Jewish Lower Silesian Voivodeship Committee was established in Richtbach, which is the Polish name for Reichenbach, which became Dzierżoniów. A memorandum was sent to the new government entitled On the Settlement of Jews in Lower Silesia, requesting the right to settle there permanently as Polish citizens. And this document stressed that many Jewish concentration camp survivors had returned to their homes, but were unable to find peace there. They needed to live in a community of people with the same spiritual interest. These were euphemisms for the takeover of Jewish properties that we know about and the resurgent anti-Semitism. And they were not lost, these euphemisms were not lost on the new government. So why Lower Silesia? Well, this is a map of Poland, and Lower Silesia is this maroon bit. Upper Silesia is this green bit, and Opole is in the middle. And here is a blow up of Lower Silesia. There is Dzierżoniów. There is Bielawa. Walbsza was another major town where the Jews settled, and a lot of these other ones around. There's Wrocław, which was Breslau. So it was largely untouched by the war, except for Breslau or Wrocław, and it had an ideal climate for agriculture, and there were many existing industries such as textiles, coal mining, lumber yards, foundries. It was beautifully set up for habitation. But the biggest bonus that was just remarkable for the incoming Jews from the Soviet Union were that the expelled Germans had to leave their homes, but they left them full of furniture, beds, linen, crockery, clothing, plus their farms and their factories and their businesses. And they were all available for distribution to the released prisoners. As for Dzierżoniów, as Reichenbach became, it is a very, very pretty round walled town. And it became the vanguard. It wasn't the biggest post-war Jewish settlement, but it became the vanguard of all of the post-war Jewish settlements. And it is indeed round. This is an aerial shot. Most of the wall is still there, and it is a really lovely little town. And this quote here, Reichenbach is a beautiful town, as whole and rounded as a nut, as a walnut. You can see the shape there. The market square is pleasant, intact. Everywhere you turn, you see Jews going about their business or standing in small clusters. Everything is peaceful. Is this a dream or a reality? And that was in early 1946. So what did the Stalin and the new Polish government, which was actually called the PKWN, or the Polish Committee of National Liberation, what did they want from the Jews? First of all, the Western Borderlands had been declared empty, as I said, and Stalin needed to fill them with Polish citizens to consolidate his sphere of influence in Poland, in Eastern Europe. And he had a ready-made cohort to send to fill the area with the hundreds of thousands of Poles, including Jews, who had fled or been deported to the Soviet Union. And at the same time, he could get rid of this Polish riffraff because he couldn't stand the Poles, and he didn't really like them living in his land. Sending Poles and Jews to completely new areas would avoid conflict with Poles who had taken over Jewish property in the towns that the Jews came from. And the Jews also were more favourably inclined to the Soviets, unlike the Poles who detested them. And it could also be a valuable PR exercise with international juries. So there was a lot going for it. So the Eggert wanted to create a Yiddische Yishuv in Niederschlese. Niederschlese was the German word for Lower Silesia, and the Polish government approved the establishment of the Jewish settlement. And over here is a picture of the first meeting of the Provincial Committee of Lower Silesian Jews in Richtbach or Cherzonev. And that's Eggert there. And they stand sitting in front of a map of Lower Silesia with the Polish white eagle, which is the symbol of Poland. Eggert was elected chair, immediately took charge. He wrote to the ZPP in Moscow, which is the Organizing Committee of Polish Jews, to facilitate the repatriation of the Jews who were in the Soviet Union. A week later, an announcement in Yiddish. Believe it or not, I couldn't believe that, but there was an announcement in Yiddish on Polish state radio. In Lower Silesia today, we have around 7,000 Jews who are joyful that after 700 years of German rule, Polish lands are finally going back to Poland, and they desire to participate in the reconstruction of these lands. So that broadcast was very, very important because this broadcast publicised the positive developments in Lower Silesia. It also was like a signal that this place was worth coming to, and because there were all these Jews who were going to be there and make them feel more familiar. But it was more than just an announcement to get people to come. This was a political stratagem to demonstrate that the Jews were totally in support of the takeover of the recovered territories. So Eggert and his team immediately established the administrative infrastructure to look after all aspects of the survivors' well-being. And it was along the CKZP model. Basically, everything you think of for social welfare and health and rehabilitation and training, etc. Another development on the 22nd of July 1945, the PKWN released a manifesto, and in that manifesto it said that the Jews would be accorded equal rights, and government support was pledged to help their civic, economic and national existence. And this made the Jews feel much more confident about going back to Poland after the war. So we are going to go back and forward between Poland and the Soviet Union for a little while. So back in the Soviet Union, a Polish-Soviet commission was established and an agreement was signed on the 6th of July 1945. And the agreement was for matters of evacuation of individuals of Polish or Jewish nationality in accordance with the agreement of the 6th of July. Now, and that meant that ethnic Poles and Polish Jews who had been Polish citizens before the 17th of September were now Soviet citizens residing in the USSR were eligible to apply to exchange the Soviet citizenship for Polish citizenship and be evacuated to Poland. Now, notice that the word repatriation was not used in this context because theoretically it means returning to one's homeland. But this particular Poland had not existed before, and it had not been in this form, and it hadn't been anyone's Polish home except for 700 years ago. So that was a problem. So this is my mother's registration, and she's also got my brother, my 2-year-old brother, on it. And this is it's sort of like an ID passport. This was her number. And she carried that. You can see there are a lot of stamps on the back, and she carried that with her everywhere. So meetings were held during 1945 to publicise the repatriation. I'm going to call it repatriation because I can't think of what else to call it. And financial aid started to come in from the overseas aid groups. And the registration was handled by the ZPP in Moscow and vetted, of course, by the NKVD to prevent Russians and Ukrainians trying to leave. Now, 85 to 90% of the Polish Jews elected to return, provided they could verify their Polish citizenship, which was not easy as many had lost their documents on their arduous journeys. Now, going back to the name of the commission, you can see that the Jews are called a nationality, and that established them as an ethnic group and a national minority, which was also very important. Now we're going back to Poland, where a ministry for the recovered territories was established under Deputy Prime Minister Gomulka, and this was responsible for supervising the expulsions of the Germans, overseeing the settlement of Polish citizens, demolishing German monuments, removing German signs. As you can see in this picture here, this was this very large park in Breslau, and they're taking the sign down because it was then going to be called Stalinisation Park. They banned the German language from schools, government and church, and they spent a lot of time fostering a sense of Polish identity in these newly acquired lands. So Eggert gets to work, and what's the first thing he does? He finds himself a beautiful, beautiful house building, which is exactly opposite the synagogue, which still existed. And this house, this is my own picture because I took that 2 years ago, and it's in almost the same condition as when he would have been there. It's really, really lovely. So Eggert was a Ganzermacher, and he created himself as the protector of the Jewish community. He had lots of energy, and he was a great organizer. But many people thought he was a megalomaniac. You can see wherever there were visitors coming to Lower Silesia, he's in every picture. That's him there when the leaders of the JDC are visiting Poland and Europe. They get well-known actresses like Molly Picon. Ben Gurion came. Everyone wanted to come to see the Jewish experiment. And as I said, Eggert is in every one of those photos, and that's him there. This, just for your interest, is my father's registration for the Health Society, which had been operating in Poland since the beginning of the last century, of the 20th century. And it was, after the war, it was revived. It was called TOS for short. And my father signed up, and he's going to pay 10 zloty a month, I think it was. So, and that's his signature there. Right, back to the USSR. The first transports leave on December 1945. The journeys were so difficult, awful they were, because don't forget, the war had just finished. There were hardly any trains left. They're trying to transport, you know, demob soldiers and all of that. And you can see just in this photo here the absolute tedium of these journeys that they had to make. Conditions inside the wagons were abysmal at first, and they had to establish medical relief brigades along the route because of the terrible conditions that these people were in, because they'd been in labour camps. They had lost absolutely everything. And you can see these people here in their rags, and this is how they would have lived and worked in Siberia and all of the other camps. And I hate looking at these shoes. I mean, they're not even shoes, they're just whatever they are, bits of leather wrapped up. The other problem that made the journey so difficult was the different rail gauges. And this photograph here shows them changing wagons when they got to a Polish border. They had to change the whole wagon, move everything across. And I love this photo because of these little kids in Bukhara in Uzbekistan. They obviously, their teacher said, well, let's make a train. And they drew this train engine, and each one had a wheel. And it tells everyone the journey that they're about to undertake from Bukhara to Warsaw. And the repatriation trains kept coming until August 1946. In fact, they kept coming until 1948, but the major part of the repatriation were completed in August. These are people with this sign on their wagon, Nach Zachod, which means on to the west. This is where this train was going. And here was a propaganda poster saying, yes, go to the west because the west is waiting. The lands in the west is waiting. So this, you can see these people are traveling in summer. You can see that there's some attempts at furnishing. There's a bit of a camp bed or something like that. And during that period from December to August 1946, 140,000 were repatriated. Now, I happened to find this manifest of a particular train journey, and there is my father, my brother, and my mother with their birth dates. All of these people came from Ufa in the Soviet Union, and that is exactly where my parents lived. And these are their repatriation certificate numbers. This list would have been probably formed for the Lower Silesian committees that were in all the towns, so they knew who was coming in and how many. So when they arrived, they were met by committee members and anyone who was hoping to find their family. Sometimes 2,000 people arrived per day. It was absolutely intense, and the population was the population growth was so intense that they had to set up new committees in new towns. This is my parents, not long after they arrived, and that's my brother there. They became quite happy. And these people are waiting to go into apartments, and so they go off and get their formal photo taken. So they were met by committee members. They were given meals. They were given allowances. Kindergartens were set up to look after children while the parents organised themselves. And each family received an apartment house far exceeding their expectations after living for 6 years in the Soviet Union. That's not to say that they all went down to Lower Silesia. Some of them settled in Łódź, some in Szczecin, and so it wasn't just these small towns. And you can see the exponential growth there. By February, when my parents arrived, there were 12,000 Jews registered in Dzierżoniów. By November, there were 17,800, almost half the entire population of Dzierżoniów. Now, Dzierżoniów was the first town to register surviving Jews, and that became a crucial resource in searching for surviving family. This is my mother's registration, and hasn't got a lot of detail there, and this is the address in Dzierżoniów. But what it did was give anyone who was looking for family some information that could help them find their own families. And these records are now held in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And this is the photo I had in my opening slide. This is here you are, the State Repatriation Office man, showing this repatriate here, the location of his new farm in Lower Silesia. And this is how it happened. We were led to Marshalka Street, where there were many tall and beautiful townhouses, and we could pick any apartment we wanted. The apartment looked as if the owners had left only for a short while to do the shopping or go for a walk. It was equipped with everything, including dishes, bed linen, clothes, even some small change left on the table. So not very long after people started arriving en masse, an Office of Productivization was established. It was established by the Jewish Committee and also by the government. And the idea was that there was a move to try and direct Jews away from traditional passive occupations such as tailoring or making shoes, and to support, it was also designed to support the economic development of the Jews. It was tied up with this idea of creating a new type of Jew who could become a miner or a farmer or a train driver, any of those sort of non-passive professions. It was also fundamental to the economic policy of a socialist Poland. And it was also great for the Zionists, who were keen to prepare people for the issue in Palestine. And it was hoped that the productivization might aid the assimilation of Jews and limit anti-Semitism. And you can see here these two rogues. I don't know, they look so roguish. They're in training to establish their own farms. These young people are in metalworking. And the big industry in Dzierżoniów, strangely, was the radio, the making of radio sets and also transmission of programs. And I love this quote. And here is Wolf Arbesman, the first Jewish farmer in Dzierżoniów. That's him there. And Joseph Tenenbaum went on a visit early in 1946, and he went out to the countryside, and he talks about going to prosperous Jewish farms, and he saw Jewish maidens milking fat German cows and Jewish farm boys chasing German pigs. Excuse me. Along with productivization, the other major social and economic development was the establishment of cooperatives. From 1945 to 1949, there were 232 Jewish cooperatives, and they were most of them were in Lower Silesia. It was no doubt a socialist movement, and it was based on the philosophy of specialists working side by side, sharing expenses and profits. The movement also reflected the socialization process of an emerging communist state. And you can see some of the different, some of the different cooperatives and agricultural cooperatives, weavers cooperatives, textile. These young people are getting trained in textiles. And there was a baker's co-op, a glass making, a bristle and brushes co-op. And the beauty of the co-ops was that they provided immediate employment after training. They had a bank to provide low interest loans, and ought the training organisation trained or retrained people to become productive workers who could make their own living. Women's employment was encouraged, but private enterprise was still possible. For example, this lone ice cream seller and this shop, a fruit shop and a shoe workshop, and then open air markets as normal. And Jewish lives took off and began to thrive. Cultural development was essential for Jewish renewal, and in 1946, the Jewish Association for Culture and Art was founded to coordinate Jewish cultural life. And by the end of 1947, so we're talking about not even 2 years, it had organised 33 libraries, 13 cultural centres, several theatre troupes, 5 choirs, 5 orchestras, a publishing house. It's just phenomenal. Now, every town had its own nearly every town had its own culture centre. And when I was there a couple of years ago, I went to this building and it's still there. It's very bedraggled and looks sort of neglected, but it's still there. And it looks almost exactly like this photograph. And so the international organisations, the JDC or the Joint, they're funding a school, they're funding a clinic, and they also started to publish a Yiddish newspaper, Das Neue Leben. And here are some more. I won't go into all of these, but these are just examples of this new life that they were forging. Here is the synagogue, which was still in reasonable nick and had not been affected by the war or by the Germans. It's a very strange building, I have to say. It's just completely square. Doesn't really look like a synagogue. But anyway, it was still there and they opened it for services. In 2004, it was completely restored, especially the inside. So here's soccer games, sports teams, Hashomer Hatzer kibbutz, marches. Every May Day they would have a march, or every commemoration like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they'd have a march and they'd all gather in the streets. You hear children from the Bialava orphanage, and fine arts and kindergartens, and Wheatso's advertising a knitting and foreign language class, and the hospital, and another kibbutz, and the children dressing up for Purim, a Vinch card sent from Jezhonia, and a workers' restaurant. These are just examples of this thriving society that they developed, and developed so quickly. But none of it could have happened without all these international organisations like ORT, like the Bund, like the Jewish Labour Committee, HIAS, the World Zionist organisations. None of it could have been done without that. And so, as more people arrived, Jezhonia became a thriving, vibrant haven. Almost half of the this population were Jews, and this was the highest percentage of Jews relative to the whole population of any town in Poland. And it became known as Polska Jerozolima, or Polish Jerusalem, although malicious Poles often called it Żydbach, or Jew town. But despite the optimism of the new life, there was still a sense of danger. There was the normal fear of robbery, rape, murder, and anti-Semitic attacks. But, and there was a time, in the early days, Lower Silesia was known as the Wild West, because once the town had become empty, then everyone was felt free to do whatever they liked. So you can see here that at every organisation, every event, there were people, men mainly, with rifles, even protecting the school at the end of the day. And this sort of sense of pride and accomplishment meant that the Jews were developing their own Jewish national culture. They had lots of political parties that was very rare in post-war Europe, and they had a lot of autonomy. Even though they had to work within the state socialist agenda, they were able to establish their own autonomy. And that was significant because it was not about land. It was not territorial. And for the government, they were pretty happy with this because they could tout to the rest of the world that Poland was not anti-Semitic, that all these Jewish achievements were proof that they could deal with anti-Semitism. But this autonomy was resented by the Poles. They saw themselves as victims of violence and oppression, first from the Nazis and now from the Soviets. And so Żydokomuna, the 20th century trope, resurfaced in earnest. That was the idea that Jews collaborated with or conspired with the Soviet Union in bringing communism to Poland, and this belief was ably fueled by the church. The Poles felt that the Jews were being favoured by giving them positions in bureaucracy, and the murder of Jews began almost immediately. Those transports started arriving. For example, 40 Jews were killed over 10 days in June 1945 alone. And they were also targeted on the trains when they were coming through. And I think this quote from Josef Litva, the Jewish repatriates were received officially by the regime with open arms, but the vast majority of the Polish population greeted them with open hostility and violence. And then Kielce, on the 4th of July, 1946, the violence erupted. A Polish child from Kielce went missing. Blood libel was immediately invoked and riots were unleashed, resulting in the brutal deaths of 42 Jews, 2 Poles and 40 injured, and no one intervened. And this mass funeral was filmed and the film went worldwide. So it was time to flee again. The Kielce pogrom became a litmus test for whether Jews would ever feel safe in Poland. And the answer was clearly no. Poland was still a cemetery, and the government gave tacit permission for the Jews to leave, and they were the only group that were allowed to leave. But where could they go? It was well known that Rita, the illegal immigration program to get Jews into Palestine and Israel, that they were operating out of the DP camps in the United States, in the US zones of Germany and Austria. And these camps seem to be the only viable destination. Between July and September 1946, about 95,000 Jews fled Poland at the rate of about 700 a day. Now, there were two ironies about the going to the DPs. The remnant of Polish Jewry found their only safety surrounded by the Germans who had tried to exterminate them. And the other irony or paradox was that the DP camps were often established into the concentration camps, which made some sense because these were big, big barracks and places like that. But it was a grim reminder of the recent horrors. And this picture is of a DP dormitory set up inside Bergen-Belsen camp. The Israelis helping the Jews to escape helped with helping them cross over the mountains from Poland to Czechoslovakia, which got them closer to Austria and Germany. And these children here are waiting in Prague after Kielce, and they seem to be orphans. The DP camps were life in the camps were no picnic. Early conditions were abysmal. There was overcrowding, poor sanitation or hardly any sanitation, malnutrition, lack of medical supplies, clothing shortages, and Jews were subjected to anti-Semitism and had to share the meagre facilities with Nazis and collaborators. Somebody reported this problem to President Truman, who sent Earl Harrison, a lawyer, to investigate the problem of the Jews in the DP camps. And he made this very, very telling remark: "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis did, except we do not exterminate them." So he recommended to Truman that separate DP camps be set up for Jews alone. And this is one of them. This is the Tikva Jewish DP camp in Bad Reichenhall. And they operated much, much better. The other thing about the DP camps were the babies. The DP camps at one stage in 1947 to 1948 had the highest birth rate in the world. Extraordinary. And this picture, this poor person is holding 4 of these babies. 48,665 babies were born per month. And we know why. We know because people were desperate to have families to replace the ones they'd lost in such awful circumstances. And so they stayed in the DP camps. The last DP camp was closed in 1954, which is an enormously long time. They had training programs for youth and anyone who wanted to retrain. And these people here are getting ready for a kibbutz in Eretz Yisrael. They are Hakshara members and they've got their sheep. So they're learning how to be good Israeli citizens. By 1948, there were between 250,000 and 300,000 Jews in the DP. And the Jews that had come in from the Soviet Union constituted approximately 2/3 of the entire Jewish DP population, and 85% of them were Polish Jews. Now, I have spent a lot of time looking at photograph after photograph after photograph of this period. But this photograph has captured my heart and still does every time I look at it. These are a group of orphans in a DP camp in Austria. They're well fed now and they're well clothed. Thank you to the JDC. But I look at them and I see hope. Here are the dreamers. Look at the dreaming face here in this girl. And the wannabe Mickey Rooneys. And this lovely, lovely face here with her eyes full of hope. But not everyone left. Not everyone went to the DP camps. They stayed in Dzержinjev and Lower Silesia, like my parents. And here they are in a park in Dzержinjev, and that's me having been born. And they made a life for themselves. And the life became more stable and they could return to normal life. And anti-Semitism seemed to, calm down. Jakob Eggert published this little booklet called Zu einer Leben 2 Jahre in die Jüdische Yeshiva in Niederschlesien, to a new life, 2 years of Yiddish Yeshiva in Lower Silesia. Eggert rejoiced in the achievements of the Jews and his hope for an ever stronger future in Poland. And in Poland of today, which was a publication of the American embassy, the Polish embassy in New York, they used to do feature articles on what was happening in Lower Silesia and Dzержinjev. And in this particular one in June 1947, they say how Dzержinjev is full of hope and they believe and they're building a new community and the will to live is stronger than any obstacles. It's a small town, but it's inhabited by people who have courage and determination. And here is my father's graduation class in his tailoring school. That's my father there. And here is a gathering of the Lublin Jews in Wrocław in 1947. And again, that's my father here. 2 years ago, I went to the third gathering of Lublin Jews. Only the third. The first was here. Then there was a second in 2017. And I found out 2 years ago that my father had been a delegate to the gathering of Lublin Jews, a delegate from Dzержinjev. So that was really fabulous to find. So in 1948, in July, in Wrocław, there was a Recovered Territories exhibition. It was a PR exercise designed to show off Polish achievements and to legitimise the takeover of the recovered territories, which were now rehabilitated after centuries of German neglect. And all these industries were flourishing. All the exports were growing exponentially because of the Polish takeover. But there was a warning in this event. A Jewish pavilion had been promised for the exhibition. Eggert had been working really hard to get the Jewish pavilion up and running. And 2 weeks before its opening, he was informed that the proposed pavilion might be appropriate for Tel Aviv, but not in Poland. And he was accused of being a nationalist and he was forced to resign. He spent 7 months in jail and then he ultimately migrated to Canada, where he published his aptly titled memoir, Grand Illusion. And the grand illusion was that his dream of a new life for a resurrected, thriving Jewish community on the ground of a democratic Poland was dead. And so the bell began to toll. Stalinisation began in earnest. All political parties were merged, political workers' parties, Zionist parties and the Bund were liquidated. Jewish cooperatives were unified under one union of cooperatives. Jewish groups were forced to secede from the World Jewish Congress. Jewish schools were nationalised. Yiddish and Hebrew were eliminated. International groups were expelled. Religious institutions replaced by one religious union of Mosaic faith. The Jewish press was reduced to one weekly newspaper. And in 1950, all Jewish committees, the CKZP, the Lower Silesian Jewish Committee, were all replaced by one organisation called the Society of Social Cultural Jews in Poland, or the TSKZ, which still operates today. There is this change in just more or less 1 year was cataclysmic, and it was impossible to counteract this onslaught. Why did the Jewish experiment fail? Multiple reasons. All those departures after Kielce and all the other pogroms, that led to this bleeding of people. The autonomy of the community was seen as a threat to Polish nationality. Israel had been established in 1948, and now that provided the Jews with a legal destination. All those institutions closing did not augur well for a continuation of Jewish life there. The Polish resentment just kept growing. Stalin was becoming increasingly paranoid, and the Soviet and Polish policymakers and Polish press were inherently anti-Semitic. And so by 1949, the Jewish population of Dzierżoniów had fallen to 5,700 from a high of nearly 18,000. By 1950, the Jewish population in Poland had shrunk to 45,000, and Jewish migration ceased altogether in December 1950. And we managed to come to Australia in May 1950. And in the end, it was the very acquisition of the recovered territories which intensified a sense of nationalism and Polishness. But Jews could only feel at home in Poland by participating in this Polishness to their own detriment. The government had promised the Jews equality, individual freedom, and possibilities for a collective Jewish national life, but none of those promises were realised. After a millennial presence in these lands, Jews were finally being driven out of Poland. Two further waves of immigration in 1956 and 68 ensued, and Poland's communist rulers fulfilled the dream of Polish nationalists by bringing into existence an ethnically pure state. But look what they achieved in just 4.5 years. That's all, 4.5 years. They provided food, clothing, housing, financial assistance, and healthcare for weary survivors. They established childcare services such as creches, orphanages, ran education programs, schools, curricula, textbook development, and all those cultural activities that I listed before. They had vocational training and retraining in cooperation with ORT, and they established and equipped the cooperatives and provided employment opportunities. And they did all of that within a culture of togetherness and mutual support. And they did it. And so that was one of their crowning achievements. And don't forget, just 4.5 short years. So I ask the question again, why should we care? In less than 5 years, the Jews of Lower Silesia had achieved remarkable success. After spending hard years in concentration camps and exile in Siberia and Soviet Central Asia, they returned to Poland to find their families. homes and former lives destroyed. With resilience and hard work, with resolve and strength, they created a new life, a vibrant life, only to be thwarted by ancient hatreds and modern politics. These brave and irrepressible people deserve our admiration and much more recognition than they have received to date. And as for my family, just this brief survey of what happened to us. 98% of their family were murdered. They arrived in Sydney in May 1950 and settled in Bondi, set up a clothing factory, employed a few workers. They worked too hard. They educated a doctor and a teacher. They were fiercely independent, and they were grateful for every day in Australia. And my main regret is that they died far too young. That's the end of my talk. Just a reminder that you can read my article on the return to Poland in Musings at the Sydney Jewish Museum Journal. And if any of you have questions, or if any of you have a story about Siberia and about the return, then I'd love to hear about it, and you can contact me at that email address. Thank you for listening, and I do apologise for the glitch at the beginning.
And ASPJ, and I would like to thank you, Rita, for another compelling presentation. The thing that was most moving for me in today's presentation, as it was last week's, is the way that all of our histories, I'm sure that there's a significant number of us here in the audience whose family histories interweave with yours and resound and fill gaps. Your talk fills gaps of many of the bits that some of us didn't ask or didn't have the wherewithal to ask, and enough knowledge of the history which we're all trying to patch together now at this late stage. So I'd like to thank you again on a very personal level for this wonderful talk, and also to thank, of course, the wonderful tech support at Polaron, and Anouk, who is beaming to us from Belgium this evening, which is really wonderful. Makes it almost it makes it even more wonderful, really. I'd like to just remind you all that there is another webinar on Thursday, the 12th of June, on Treblinka, sadly, putting names to members, that will be presented by winners of the Polin Museum Award in 2024, Pavel Savitsky and Eva Telezinska-Savitska. So that will be, I have met them. It will be a compelling talk as well and worth the listen. I would like to remind you that questions we're happy to field questions if you put any questions that you have in the chat. We'd be very happy to help. It was a pretty comprehensive talk, I think, Rita. And so there was one comment that somebody's family had come through Bad Reichel as well, or had been born there. So obviously the talk has resounded for many of us with our own histories. So at the moment I can't see. Hang on, I'm lying. Can we get a recording? There will. That's a really good comment. Actually, all of our talks, all of our webinars are actually recorded, and they're available on our ASPJ website, on our Facebook site, and also, so that's where they are, and all of them are compelling listening, and especially with information as compelling and as dense as what Rita's was. I will myself be going back through those talks to look at the slides again and to put together a package of what I've missed. I think there'll be some transcripts as well available for people where the sound was, I think, perhaps not as clear as it might have been at different times. I'm not sure. That seemed perfect to me, but there you go. Yes, so all of those talks are available. Thank you. And it seems like there are no more questions. I'll just do another double check. That was answered. That was answered. No. So if there is no more, and from anybody else, I wish you a good night, and resisting the urge to make commentary where we sit at the moment.
I won't take it personally.
No, it's nothing to do. It's more to do with our political situation and the reverberations through time that I find really difficult. I wish you all a good night, and shalom and peace. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Good night.